We are now recording, and now let me get the screen shared with you, and now we can start. Um, uh, so is this the slide? There we go. Okay.
There we go. Okay.
I think somebody may have their phone and I'm not sure
And
why.
I'm not sure
Okay,
why.
now it's starting to work.
Okay, now it's starting to work.
So I'm muting everybody. You're allowed to unmute yourself. So whenever you want to, just hold your space bar down or push that microphone icon and we can start a conversation. I am going to, in a sense, start with an apology. There is so much happening in the world right now. And if you want to, we can pivot out of the lecture that I have for you today, which is really about making democracy work better, and instead move into talking about the looming ground invasion in Israel. And ultimately, I will pivot back to those worldly topics as they demand our attention. It seems to me, in a sense, right now, I don't have a ton more to say. I do think that the Israeli government is, in a sense, deadlocked because they're facing a genuine dilemma. On the one hand, the idea of letting Hamas, which has become obviously a brutal terrorist organization, stay simply on the border right next door, miles away, suffer no recriminations for having invaded Israel and having slaughtered 1,400
David,
civilians, having taken hostages, does not seem tenable. But on the other hand, the invasion cannot eliminate Hamas.
yeah,
And
David.
oh, go ahead. Sorry, is that Ann?
Could we just go on to your making democracy better?
Yes.
I'm too overloaded with Israeli news.
Okay. So that's where I'm going. I'm just saying that, like the rest of you, I'm mortified, and
Yes.
and we will come back to talk about that, but I don't have more to say right now. So let
Thank
us move on. And so what I want to do is talk about making democracy work better, and in particular, to talk about the philosophical foundations of democracy. So pulling way back from the contemporary news, but also the way in which, in a sense, we remain haunted by those foundations in ways that may lead us to think in different ways about democratic reform and their necessity. So I'm going to start by differentiating two approaches to democratic reform in the 21st century. One approach is to say, and I will focus on the United States, but this is an issue that has implications for the rest of the democratic world, arguably for the rest of the world, that we could take the structures of democracy as we have it now and ask, have they broken down? If they've broken down, why have they broken down? And what can we do to repair them? And in the context of the United States, I'm going to suggest to you that one of the critical items for our agenda, if we take this approach, is going to be, what can we do to make our institutions less prone to capture by minorities and elites, and more responsive to majority understandings and demands. And so that is to say, this approach implicitly says we got a lot right in the 18th century when we wrote our Constitution, and in the 19th century when we amended our Constitution to remove the blight of the accommodation of slavery within it. And in the 20th century, when via constitutional amendment allowing women to vote and the collection of federal taxes, but also via the Supreme Court and the Civil Rights Revolution and the revolution in the scope of the federal government associated with the New Deal, we were on our way to effectively institutionalizing a functioning modern democracy in the United States. And so let us figure out how we fell off that path and what we can do to get back on it. The second approach says, look, we're not in the 18th or 19th or even 20th centuries anymore. We are in the 21st century. And in the 21st century, we have the advantage of there being experiments with democracy around the world. When the United States started its experiment, it was unprecedented. In the 21st century, there are so many other places we could learn from. Why saddle ourselves with the baggage of repairing old institutions as opposed to taking a more systematic approach and trying to create a 21st century democracy for a 21st century society? And I want to be as clear as possible. I don't think that those two approaches are mutually exclusive. Which is to say, we can simultaneously repair the old and work on innovating with new institutions, new forms, new experiments. But there is a question of limited political capital and energy. Which one of these two should we emphasize first and foremost, should be our main priority? And so today I'm going to consider the first possibility, the first fork in this path that leads to democratic reform. And that is to ask the question, has democracy been perverted in the 21st century? And if so, can it be repaired? And to set that idea up, I want to look then at the origins, the philosophical and revolutionary ideas that were the rallying calls and cries of the 18th and 19th century democratic revolutions, and the peculiar situation of having a democracy founded on a revolution and the aims and claims it articulated. And so what I'm going to suggest is that almost by their very nature, revolutions produce aspirations that are difficult to realize in the ordinary world of mundane routine politics. And this is so in part because revolutionaries, the people who are the typically elite, who decide at a moment in history that it is in their interest to change the regime through which political powers organized, maybe even the very character of the society as such, a social or a political revolution, typically can't bring revolutions about on their own. They need to enlist larger segments of the population, and so they tend to rely on rhetoric, on claims, on aims and purposes that are going to inspire a broader mass political movement. And this was certainly true in the United States. It was true in France in the Revolution of 1789, that there is this structural dynamic that encourages the articulation of broad-based revolutionary claims. If you support our revolution, we will make the world more amenable to your freedom, your equality, your interests. And so democratic revolutions in part elaborate or rely on promises, ideas, ideals that are more radical often than the intention of the revolutionaries themselves. But I want to offer a second explanation for the difficulty of institutionalizing revolutionary aspirations. And that comes from the fact that revolutions are what is sometimes called a liminal moment in the sense of they occur at a time when the old institutions are breaking down, when their fragility is such that people can envision new possibilities, and a time in which, therefore, ideals seem like they have a greater chance of being realized in our politics. And in those moments, that tends to bring out the idealism in people, and in particular in those who are crafting the speeches and the institutions that emerge from the revolution. And so there's a environment in which taking seriously normative claims in politics has greater plausibility, precisely because the old regime is crumbling and we're building a new regime together. That is the very nature of a democratic revolution. And so democratic ideas tend to emerge from revolutionary culture and politics, and they tend to articulate rights and put those rights into constitutions in the form of democratic aspirations. We will have the right to vote, but via voting, we will have equal influence over our shared fate, over our political decisions. And it's very difficult actually to do that in the world, right? To create a form of government in which everyone has an equal opportunity to influence the decisions being made, and the decisions made actually effectively influence the social environment of the society, right? Both finding a form of politics in which everybody has equal influence, and finding forms of law and policy that actually successfully steer the social world are tremendously difficult undertakings, and so they tend to fail more often than they succeed. But democratic revolutions tend to describe a future in which those aspirations will be realized, and so those aspirations tend to be counterfactual. They tend to be in tension with the actual reality of politics. And so there is a built-in tension in democratic polities. They have built into their very constitution, into the rights they contain and the culture surrounding the understanding of those rights, aspirations to effective control over the world that are not easily realized. And these aspirations tend not to just be integrated into the Constitution, they tend to be integrated into the culture, the democratic political culture of societies that have had successful democratic revolutions. And via the culture, they become integrated into our own self-understandings, what we think we want out of citizenship. And so we tend to conceive of ourselves as free and equal citizens, as members of a self-determining people, a people who can actually determine their own future. And we also tend to want to be seen as members of a cooperating society, a society where we work together to exercise influence over our shared social fate. And yet, again, those are difficult aspirations. And so there is a tension. And I want to say at points that is a constructive tension, and at points it is a destructive tension. And so recognizing that at points we aim to realize a society in which no one is dominated, in which everybody equally influences the capacity of the society to determine itself, and therefore all are respected as free and equal citizens in the way we make our political decisions. That has been a tremendously powerful aspiration, but it calls for a kind of democratic justice, that if we are successful in institutionalizing our democracy, we will have a fair, just, cooperative, democratic, political, and social world. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but no such world has probably ever existed, right? And so there is this tension, this constitutive tension between the aspirations and the reality of a democratic society that is built into the very emergence of democracy and democratic revolutions. So why is it so hard to realize the democratic aspiration? And I'm going to point to two factors. One of them is that democracy is not the whole of the social world, right? We live in capitalist or market societies. We live in societies with complex racial and gender orders, with technology that we have a very hard time controlling how it is employed commercially, etc. And so other social forces in our worlds make it very difficult to exercise effective democratic control. When we live in a market economy, there are forms of inequality and vulnerability that typically result from the operation of the market that are difficult to reconcile with democratic ideals of equality and cooperation. And by the way, we've yet really to see a successful democracy in the world that isn't paired with a market economy. And so it's not like we can just say, oh, well, if capitalism is incompatible with democracy, let's get rid of capitalism. You still have to eat. You still have to employ people. You still have to, quote, reproduce the material basis of your society, the food, the medicine, the housing, the clothing, the commodities that people have grown accustomed to. They're not going to sacrifice in the name of democracy. Yes, we might sacrifice a certain level of wealth, a certain kind of concentrated wealth, and we have done better in the recent past in terms of the distribution of wealth and income. But there is a perpetual tension between a market economy and a democratic polity. Similarly, a second reason why democracy is hard to institutionalize in the modern world is that these are large, diverse, complex societies, right? We have hundreds of millions of citizens in the United States today, and the result is we can't all actually come together to share in the project of determining the policies, the decisions, and ultimately the fate of our society. We elect representatives to do that work, right? And it's hard to have meaningful elections without having political parties, and political parties tend to end up having their own interests that may be somewhat distinct from those of the people who affiliate with the party, right? And that's just the beginning of recognizing that there's an intrinsic limit to the degree to which we can democratize a modern society, given its size, its diversity, its complexity, and the institutional difficulties that then attend organizing democracy on that scale in those conditions. And so I want to suggest that one of the things we should be paying attention to when we think about, can we repair the kind of democracy we inherit from the 18th and 19th centuries, is the tension, the tension that is not going to be eliminated between the ideals articulated in our history and our Constitution, in the better moments of American politics, whether that's Lincoln at Gettysburg, or the founding of our Constitution, or Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement, right? There are really important moments of holding democracy to account for the ideals on which it is founded. And then there are clear periods, long periods in which those ideals produce not reform, but frustration, right? And so how severe the tension is between the promise of democracy and the realization of democracy seems to me to be a really important variable in thinking about what kind of democratic reform we get in a particular moment. When the gradient, I'm referring to it as, right, a gradient between the promise and the experience of democracy is too steep, when therefore the promise loses its credibility or becomes a source of deep frustration, we tend to get a politics that looks for scapegoats, that looks for someone to blame, that holds out ideal but unrealizable goals. In the right circumstances, however, that tension can lead to movements, to efforts to more fully institutionalize our democracy. In the wrong circumstance, it results in distrust in democracy as such, a drift towards authoritarianism, scapegoating certain members of our population for the failures of our democracy. And so I want to suggest then that realizing democracy in general, and not just in America in the 21st century, is a protracted struggle in the aftermath of the revolution. So it's a mistake to think that democracy is institutionalized all once and for all in the moment of the founding, right? And we know our history well enough to know that when we were founded, our Constitution was a slave charter, that the majority of people in the country didn't have the right to vote, to participate in politics, that women, for almost the entirety of the first 120 years of our experiment with the Constitution, lacked not only the right to vote, but even the right to testify in their own trials, basically were excluded from almost every right associated with citizenship. And so, as opposed to seeing it as a right once and for all founding, it's much better to look at democracy as an ongoing struggle to realize the promise articulated in the revolution, but always imperfectly institutionalized. And are we overdue for another moment like the moments that we take the most pride in which we reaffirm our commitment to these ideals and our need to struggle for them? I would suggest to you that is certainly one way of reading the emerging, and it appears to be the increasing majority coalition of Americans who say we need a multiracial and post-traditional democracy in our society in the 21st century. The sheer fact that there appears to be a majority in favor of that is a major threat to others within our society. And so it's not surprising that democracy is in crisis in this moment in the 21st century. Is our best approach to go back to our revolution, the promise it articulated, our history, its high points, and to say we want to renew our faith in these institutions? And so right, that this idea that there's a kind of back and forth between what I'm calling in the language of contemporary political theory, constituent moments where we say we're going to reconstitute our democracy to make it work better, and long periods of backsliding where, in fact, once the constituent moment is over, the promise begins to fade and elites begin to erode the institutional progress that was made in the moment of democratic mobilization and fidelity. So with all of this in mind, I want to then pose the question, right? When does democratic reform tend to succeed? When does it fail? Who in the population of a democracy tends to carry the weight of better realizing our democratic ideals by turning out in social movements, by demanding reform, by making the elite in the society pay a high price if reform is not in fact realized, implemented. And so to be as clear as possible, there are people in our society who benefit from inequality, who benefit from hierarchies of status, power, and wealth, and who are threatened by the idea of a fuller democratization of our polity and by the promise of democratic justice that tends to accompany the aspiration for greater democracy. Those people currently doing well under the dispensation of the former limited kind of democracy we have don't want a more full and radical version of democracy. Those who are excluded from political equality, social resources, economic opportunity, and full dignity are often the most ardent defenders of democracy and democratic justice. They are suing to have the promise of democracy better realized and realized for people like them. And again, I think we look at the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, prior to that, the abolition movement and the movement for Reconstruction, and we see it's precisely those who are completely excluded from citizenship who are most likely to hold the society to account for the democratic ideals that it is failing to live up to. So we've got a struggle between the currently privileged and the currently excluded or marginal. Who wins in that struggle, right? And you might say, well, the decks are stacked in favor of the privileged. And I think that that's basically true. But having said that, there is a leverage that those who are currently marginal or disempowered have. And that is in the very content of the democratic, you might call it an ideology, you might call it a philosophy, you might call it the promise of the Constitution, which seems to articulate standards that the current society fails to live up to. And so the elite, if they're not just going to say, well, that might be what we said in 1789, but we don't need it anymore, we don't mean it anymore, we'll have to find some way of justifying the limited form of democracy we have as the best realization or a true realization of democracy. And that opens the door for those who are marginal, excluded, underprivileged to say, oh no, that's not true. And if you mean what you say, then you have to acknowledge that there are better ways of democratizing. And so there's a foothold, there's a lever that can be used in the struggle to repair existing forms of democracy. And that is, I think, one critical advantage that the first fork has, right? We're just trying to live up to what we say we believe and what we claim we cherish. By the way, one of the really important determinants of whether that approach to reform succeeds, I think, is where the middle goes. We've got an elite, we've got people who are feeling excluded or disrespected by the current dispensation. And then we've got those in the middle, right? And they may be a larger or a smaller portion of society, but they're almost never an inconsequential portion of society. The middle strata typically are afforded equal political rights, but not full social inclusion or dignity. And they may be co-opted by those above them who say, look, you're like us, and therefore you should be committed to keeping those others who are trying to take what you have from you down and out of political empowerment. Or they may join, right? The unruly politics of justice and democracy from below and say, look, actually our situation is more similar to the situation of those who are marginal, excluded, kept down, not given genuine democratic justice. And so I hope this idea is making sense, right? That democracies start with a promise that they almost never realize, that the history of successful democratization is a process in which very often the ideals of the revolution are used as battering rams to call for greater inclusion, greater democratization against those who benefit from the limited way in which democracy is realized. And that although that works in moments, those moments are hard to sustain. And when the people are no longer mobilized, the elite very often find ways of backsliding, of undoing some of what the moments of mobilization, what I'm calling constituent moments, succeed. And so there are, right, these dialectics. The process of democratization moves forward 2 steps, the movement loses energy, and it slides back 1 step. And this then suggests that we have to raise the question, could we do this again in the 21st century? And I do think part of what we're seeing in Black Lives Matter, part of what we're seeing in #MeToo, part of what we're seeing in the high rate of turnout in these most recent elections is signs that the moment may be right for a new era of democratic mobilization on behalf of the promise of the revolution and the Constitution, the first fork. Just rededicate ourselves to the institutions we already have. And yet, and obviously I'm now pivoting into the politics of the moment. And hopefully this is a little less stressful than thinking about Israel-Palestine right now. Since we last spoke, Mike Johnson has become the Speaker of the House. And I'm going to say a little bit about this in the context of what we've just discussed. What does this bode for the path of reform that says, let's take the institutions we have and better and more fully realize the promise of democracy they contain? And I'm going to suggest to you that there is, it seems to me, a clear implication of this, and that is what I'm going to call a consolidation of minority rule in what should be the most democratic of the institutions of the United States, the House of Representatives. And so I'm going to start with the question. I'm going to state the obvious, right? That Mike Johnson is himself a member of the Freedom Caucus. He is on the far right. He is, as he's being referred to now, MAGA Mike, clearly affiliated with the Make America Great Again wing of the Republican Party, the Trump wing of the Republican Party. Was it inevitable that someone like him would become the next Speaker of the House? And I want to suggest that there were clear political institutional dynamics that favored someone like Mike Johnson ascending. And this has to do with the relationship between the so-called Freedom Caucus, those people who don't want to allow them to label themselves, tend to call them the Chaos Caucus. The outgoing speaker, Kevin McCarthy, called them the Burn It Down Caucus, right? That when you have a substantial portion of a legislative caucus or constituency, the Freedom Caucus is about 10% of the Republican members of the House of Representatives, who have very limited interest in governing, who believe that it might actually be a good thing to shut government down for a while, right? To allow the continuing resolution that is funding the government to expire and not to replace it. They don't have a strong interest in reaching an agreement or negotiating with the other side. That it's almost exactly symmetrical. Roughly 20 rather moderate Republicans in the Republican caucus, people who represent districts that Joe Biden won, and these 20 members of the Freedom Caucus who are on the far right of the political spectrum. And so why didn't they nullify each other, cancel each other out, so that the middle of the Republican Party won? Because they were not symmetrically positioned, because actually the 20 moderate members of the House Republican caucus desperately want to get back about the business of governing, and they can't do that as long as the House doesn't have a speaker. And so the Freedom Caucus knew that they had a great deal of leverage, and ultimately the moderate Republicans, although they succeeded in torpedoing perhaps the Trumpiest of the candidates, Jim Jordan, they in the end had to accede to somebody else from this caucus actually taking the gavel. And so then I want to ask next, what does this represent? And the obvious answer is that we've got the least experienced speaker in 140 years at a moment where we are suffering real crises of governance in this society, right? Where we've got basically less than 3 weeks to hammer out the entire federal budget, where the Senate and the presidency are controlled by the Democrats. And so there's going to have to be a lot of negotiation and give and take. And we've got a man who has really no leadership experience, almost no legislative experience. By all accounts, I think he's a reasonably qualified lawyer, and maybe brings some intelligence and energy to the office. And we can hope perhaps that the office brings out a pragmatic streak in Mike Johnson. But even if it does, the fact that he's going to be learning on the job at a moment where there is so much of consequence to the government functioning, and functioning rapidly and relatively efficiently, I just think it's quite worrisome that this was the outcome of the leadership struggle. And so this raises the question: will the Republicans be able to govern under Johnson's leadership? I'm joking in a way between contrasting MAGA Mike with moderate Mike. Which of those two will actually assume the leadership of the House? I have no reason to expect that it will be moderate Mike, but even if it is, my suggestion is that it's going to be very difficult for him to bring the rest of the Freedom Caucus along. The only hope would be if they recognize that he is one of their own, and he therefore has greater capacity to bring them in line with what is required for governance. Let's consider the alternative, which is that everything that he has displayed in his career up to now predicts how he is going to behave once he actually is the leader of the House. And that means that he is going to continue to be a Christian nationalist. And I want to be as clear as possible. This is a term that he himself does not use to describe himself, but when he gave his acceptance speech and in almost everything he's done in Congress and in the decade before Congress, seems very much to hew to the politics of Christian nationalism. And in fact, he has done legal work representing and allied with the Alliance Defending Freedom, which, as you may know, was one of the main architects of anti-abortion bills in Texas and Louisiana that ultimately resulted in overturning Roe v. Wade, and that has increasingly set its sights on making further legal changes that will scale back the rights of homosexuals, the rights of gender non-conforming people in our society. And they do so because they read the Constitution as fundamentally a Christian document, that the language of the Bill of Rights, the language of the preamble to the Constitution, but especially the language of the Declaration of Independence, which speaks of us being created and endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, and then the Bill of Rights is seen as articulating those rights. That language, they think, reflects the fact that the founders understood the Constitution to be fundamentally a Christian document, and that the First Amendment's protection of religious liberty and separation of church and state was not meant to protect the state from religion, only religion from the state. That therefore they are justified in maintaining the identity of the nation as a Christian and a conservative understanding of Christianity. I imagine that there are many Christians who are deeply critical of this understanding of politics as well as of Christianity, but nevertheless, their understanding is that they are justified in maintaining citizenship as a privilege for Christians, maintaining the Constitution as a document that is essentially meant to be read in light of conservative Christian values. And what I find to be so troubling and so difficult about this, and what leads me to wonder, how well we can repair our 18th century Constitution, is that the most democratic institution in the federal government, the one that the founders actually understood as being democratic, whereas the Senate was understood as being aristocratic, the presidency a mixed institution, the Supreme Court a check on the excesses of democracy, the most democratic of our institutions has now been taken over by a person who I'm going to refer to as a principled minoritarian. That is someone who believes that there are good principled reasons rooted in political morality and constitutional law to empower a minority of Americans, those who identify as Christian nationalists, to determine the future of our society. And so the big question here is, will his Christian nationalism inform his leadership at the House? Is it inevitable that the Republican Party is moving in this direction? And I shared with you information last week, I'll share it with you again, that indicates that the Republican Party, due to the racial demographics as well as the cultural and other demographic changes in our society, is increasingly a minority party, and is likely to become even more so as the demographic change we're in the midst of plays out. And so if it cannot reposition itself to compete for majority support, will it reconcile itself to being a minority party and still try to rule on the basis of minority rule? I think there are powerful forces pushing the Republican Party in that direction. And in the context of what we're talking about today, the question is, do our institutions open themselves to a coherent long-term strategy on the part of one of our two main political parties to be a party of minority rule? I will point out to you, right, that although Donald Trump did not get his way in the speakership battle, right, and could not deliver for Jim Jordan, the fact that the next Speaker of the House is one of the engineers of the legal strategy for overturning the legitimate results of the 2020 election, maintaining Donald Trump in power despite the fact that he had lost both the popular and the electoral college vote. The fact that this is the new Speaker of the House speaks to just how far the party has moved to being the party of Donald Trump. And I will point out to you in the way that I have done before, that in the background of all of this, I'm sure, is the increasingly desperate legal and political battles that Trump is fighting, and his need to distract from them and to have institutional support within the federal government to try to protect him from what appears to be increasing difficulty on the horizon. So with all of that in mind, I just want to again refresh your memory where we left off last week, why it is that the strategy of minority rule, which our Constitution and institutions seem to open themselves to, is increasingly attractive to the Republican Party. I don't want to say that this is their explicit strategy, at least not one that they're stating out loud, but nevertheless, the fact that they can twice in this century lose the popular vote for the presidency, nevertheless win the electoral college vote, that they consistently lose the popular vote for the Senate as a nation, and yet maintain a very strong position in the Senate, that they can gerrymander and gain control of the House, not as advantageous for them in the 2020s. And you are probably following that there are increasing court cases that seem to be threatening the capacity of gerrymandering to succeed in controlling the House. But underlying all of this is the racial demographics, the fact that Blacks, Asians, Hispanics vote, and then it might be 8-1, 5-1, 2-1, but much more for Democrats than for Republicans, whereas white Americans are not evenly split, but very close, 53 to 42% Republican lean. And so the Democrats, as we've talked about before, have succeeded in reconstituting themselves as a multiracial coalition party. The Republicans still remain a 90% white party, and that makes it very difficult for them to assemble a majority coalition on a reliable basis. And so they are pushed in the direction structurally, dynamically, to figure out how to rationalize minority rule. I do think that Mike Johnson's ascendancy represents that kind of politics. Just to be clear about the demographics of the country, the vast majority of the country is becoming more diverse, right? Tiny little pockets in a few places that are becoming less diverse. And the result is that very quickly we will be a white minority society. Not that the whites won't remain the largest single ethnic group through most of this century, but they will not by themselves constitute a majority. And that means that the party that has succeeded in reconstituting itself as a multiracial coalition has a long-term structural advantage. That's the Democrats. And we see this in various data. I want also to note, right, that I've used two phrases to ask, do the institutions of the Constitution, right? And the Constitution, to be as clear as possible, is a constitution for a racially homogenous slave society that is a relatively traditional society. Could they be reworked to succeed as democratic institutions for a multiracial post-traditional society? Let me spell out what I mean by post-traditional, right? And so post-traditional refers to the fact, and here I'll share, sorry, a little bit of data with you, right? 1 in 4 parents in the United States are unmarried, cohabiting, or single parents. 3 in 10 Americans are now religiously unaffiliated. A substantial portion of young people in our society identify themselves as transgender or non-binary. Women are increasingly challenging traditional gender roles in both the family and the workplace. And so in all of these places, in terms of religion, in terms of gender, in terms of family structure, in terms of sexuality, our society is not a society in which people simply do what their parents have done. Call that kind of society a traditional society. We are increasingly a post-traditional society. For many of us, that's not a problem. That's something we value and celebrate. But I think we have to recognize that for a portion of our population, this is extremely threatening. And you add to that, and I want to get at the question, why has being anti-woke, right? You hear this particularly from Ron DeSantis, but it's all over the Republican Party. Wokeism has become the new way they identify their opponents. And I'm smiling, but there's a venom in the way in which that term is being employed. Why has that become the big rallying call, at least one of the big rallying calls of the 21st century Republican Party? And it's in part to do with the fact that from the 1960s through the present, we've spoken a little bit about Black Lives Matter, #MeToo, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the immigrants' rights movement. We could keep going, gay rights, politics as well. Major social movements in the second half of the 20th century, the first quarter of the 21st century, revealed that the taken for granted central normative cultural roles and identities of our society are not nearly as legitimate for a large swath of our population as the culture seemed to believe, right? And so we've moved into a political contest about whether or not the traditional roles, identities, and values of our culture are legitimate or need to be reformed or rejected. And the effort to expose the illegitimacy of these roles in the eyes of the people participating in these social movements generated anxiety and provoked backlash. We can think of the anti-equal rights amendment politics of people like Phyllis Schlafly, but more generally, and this connects it back to to Christian nationalism, right? The idea that Christian values and evangelical politics need to play a central place in our politics reflects the backlash against those who challenge the justice and morality of those traditional values that had served to organize the lives of many Americans. And so once tradition loses its hegemony, right? It's no longer simply taken for granted. It's no longer organically reproduced simply because people just do what their parents have done, what they were socialized into as children. Then, right, that's lost its hold. It becomes, if you want to uphold those traditions, if you want to reproduce those values, a matter of trying to legislate, trying to coerce people to reimpose tradition. And again, I want to suggest that this is increasingly the direction that the Republican Party is taking. It's movement in the direction of autocracy, authoritarianism, less respect for liberal individual rights is deeply rooted in the cultural politics of the 21st century. And so the idea that a white Christian nationalist is in charge of the House is not, I think, an unfortunate upshot of our current historical moment. It is deeply rooted in these underlying trends, and it raises the question, in this kind of political moment, is it possible to take the institutions of the 18th century and make them work for us in the 21st century? I don't want to say it's impossible, and I'm going to get to, as we move on, ideas about how to revitalize our House of Representatives, our Senate, our presidency, our Supreme Court. But I do want to point out that in a sense, this is going to be an uphill battle. And so having a double-barreled approach to democratic reform in which we take seriously the idea that although we deeply respect and get a lot of political mileage out of the defense of our institutions, we may need to start thinking about alternatives, new ways of institutionalizing democracy for the 21st century that are less prone to minority or elite capture and give better outlets for the anxieties and grievances of the 21st century than our current politics do. I'll stop there. I hope you have a sense of where we're going and how what we're doing together connects to at least the domestic political scene of the United States in the 2020s. I'm doing my best to toggle back and forth, as I said I would, between the more philosophical, long-term reform ideas and the contemporary politics of the moment. Anybody want to start us out with a question or a thought? Go ahead.
May I?
Yep, and you're unmuted. Start us out. Oh no, you went back to being muted. I heard you for a second. Hold that. There you go.
Last week, I mentioned J.D. Vance, the hillbilly elegy.
Yes.
I think he has something to tell us. Whether or not I respect what he is telling us is something else. But I have listened to his maybe call excuses or explanations for the kind of people who stormed our White House. I think he's trying to tell us where they came from. Now, take it away if you can. What do you think of his hillbilly elegy? It is a very interesting and shocking book. I think it needs to be read and addressed.
So I'll say that I've read J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. I think it's about 6 years old. Is that when it was published? 2016, 2017. And so it's been a few years since I've read it, and I've read a few books since then that maybe prevent me from remembering it as clearly as I should. But let me characterize the argument of the book, right? So he's looking at the politics of, roughly speaking, poor white America, and in particular, the Appalachian area, West Virginia, for instance, where he's from, and then the question of the culture of poor white people in the area. And so part of his claim is that poor whites have a culture of lack of success, and so part of the reason that there is such long-standing intergenerational poverty in that area of the United States is because these are people who prefer drug abuse and criminality, for instance, to hard work. And so, just so you know, J.D. Vance came from this area, went to, I believe it was Harvard, then into management consulting, made a lot of money, and then became a chronicler of the struggles of this area of the country, and then became, right, a politician, a MAGA politician who is now in the Senate representing Ohio, right? And so, having said all of that, when I read his book, I remember my dominant impression being, on the one hand, I think it's always important to get inside the heads of the people who you have the most trouble understanding. And so I absolutely believe that there is, a third of our society supporting Donald Trump. They are our fellow citizens. We may find their politics despicable at points, right? But we also have to be able to understand them well enough to be able to determine, is there something we could be doing that would give you more constructive outlet for your grievances, right? And that's part of the framework of today's lectures, to suggest that the promises of democracy can result in the politics of grievance, anger, anxiety, resentment, targeting scapegoats, or it can result in meaningful democratic political reform that includes those who have been marginalized in the overall project of self-rule and democratic justice. Why does it take one fork sometimes, the other fork other times? Why in the 21st century do we have such a large portion of the population who's attracted to scapegoating and autocracy as opposed to democratic reform? J.D. Vance helps us to answer that question, but I also find him to be overly cultural in his explanation, and in a sense to engage in some blaming of the victim. And so, yes, there may be cultural pathologies to poor Appalachian whites, but there are also real problems with their economy, such that not all of them can go to Harvard and become management consultants and then make millions of dollars writing books and then become senators, right? That's just not a path open to the vast majority of them. Were there things we could have been doing to better include them in a 21st century economy? And I'll point to the Tennessee Valley Authority as being what we did in the 20th century that actually worked, right? We electrified, we created new jobs. And so there are alternatives to a cultural explanation, a more structural economic explanation that I prefer. And then there are alternatives to getting inside the heads of the people who are engaged in the politics of grievance in the 21st century. I've shared with you before the real admiration that I have for the work by Catherine Kramer on rural politics in Wisconsin, or the work, I'm blanking on the name, Strangers in Their Own Land. Who's the author of that book? The sociologist at UC Berkeley, who, quote, tries to scale the empathy wall. It'll come to me, or Google will help me find it. Give me just a moment.
Arlie,
Arlie Hochschild. Yes, thank you. Yeah, and
Hochschild.
as soon as you start saying it, it comes back to me. So that's that work I find to have empathy for those whose politics we don't like, cultural insight, but also structural economic explanation. And so that's the quick disquisition on why I'm not a huge J.D. Vance fan in terms of that work. Marion, it looks like you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to tell you, we're reading Hillbilly Elegy for the book club here for next month in about 2 weeks. But what's I found particularly interesting is the fact that the industrial changes, the outsourcing of industry that lost people their jobs. He explains that as one of the major problems in the problem of you know, the parts of the country that didn't seem to be able to readjust themselves to what's available in terms of work. And then the other part of this story is the terrible behavior that people exhibited in Appalachia. He describes the fact that nobody stays married or stays partnered for more than a couple of years. There's huge amount of violence between them. There's all kinds of drug use and all kinds of alcoholism and all kinds of non-functioning families that go in with the fact that the white population of Appalachia just didn't move upward. So I think he does a wonderful job of describing the economic problems that were underlying all of these issues, but the personal misbehavior problems that made a mess of their lives.
And so I appreciate that, Marion, and that's helpful in refreshing my memory of some of the. So I'm ambivalent about the book. I did read it. I did learn from reading it. It's just there are aspects of it that I also remember thinking that there were better works out there and better explanations. Let me point to another, and again, I think they're similar, but I think they're also slightly different emphases. So you may have seen Ann Case and Angus Deaton, who we've talked about together before, who are economists at Princeton, who wrote the book on deaths of despair, ultimately coined that term. And they have recently put out a new paper on the post-COVID data on the decline in life expectancy in the United States. And so we're really the only industrial developed democracy in the world where the lifespan has been going down consistently for about 20 years. And they're pointing to some of the same things, which is that unlike Appalachia, this is happening in the Midwest and the Rust Belt, where the economy was a different economy, right? It was an industrial economy as opposed to an agrarian economy. But having said that, we've transitioned to a post-industrial, post-agrarian economy. And the result is that for those who have not made the transition, and I want to be as clear as possible, this is especially or almost exclusively true for white Americans who have not made the transition. It's much less true for African Americans, Latinos, Asians, and not that they're not being left out of the new economy. Huge swaths of the population are being left out of the new economy, but they're not succumbing to the same degree to drug abuse, to alcoholism, suicide, to the things that we refer to as deaths of despair. And that part of the reason is that they did not have the expectations that the white working class and some of the white agricultural poor had, which is that they were in a relatively privileged position in this society. And so I go back to Arlie Russell Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land, and the metaphor that she uses for the white Louisianans that she's studying, who say, look, we felt like we were in line on the road to opportunity. And with hard work and patience, we would eventually make our way over the ridge to the city on the hill, the land of opportunity, the place of material security. That was at least a viable aspiration to have for white Americans in the middle of the 20th century, given the way our economy was working. And that for the last, and then 30, 40, 50 years, that no longer seems true. And I think that's absolutely right. And so the hope of economic security, of mobility for your children, has been shattered. And that is something that gives rise to both deep anxiety and deep grievance. But then you add what's really important to Hochschild's image here, which is at the same time that the line that we were standing in that led to opportunity has stagnated, we're actually being pushed backwards because people are cutting in line ahead of us. And those people are Black, and those people are Latino, and those people are recent immigrants. And the government is assisting them in getting in line ahead of us. And this is where I think it gets deeply problematic, because this is where it feeds into the politics of scapegoating. And this is where I think, in a sense, the sympathy has to end, because there's a narrative, an explanation for why opportunity is broken down. And it's a seductive narrative. It's because other people are stealing our opportunities. It's also an obviously false narrative. If we look at the distribution of income and wealth, it's not the case that Black people and Latinos and immigrants, due to the politics of affirmative action and the wokeism of the people on the left, are taking the opportunities that used to be there. It's because the economy has changed, and because our government has failed to put in place policies that help our population adjust to the economic change. And the reason the government has not adequately reacted, transitioned to the new economy, is not because it's paying too much attention to Blacks and Latinos and immigrants and women and gay. It's because it's captured by economic elites. And so that's, to elaborate a little bit more, I wish I could be there for your reading group and reread J.D. Vance with you, but I certainly would also say, here's some other stuff I think we should be talking about as we have this conversation. Anybody else with a question or a comment today? We're already almost 20 minutes over, but I'm happy to keep going if you have other thoughts. Yeah, go ahead, Ruth.
Well, we just came back from New York, and at Kennedy, going into Manhattan, we took a cab, and the driver talked a lot about how the city is spending all this money on immigrants. They're on the Roosevelt Hotel, and that's terrible. It's his tax money that's going to them, and ranting and raving. Meanwhile, he cheated us because he never told us that he wouldn't take credit cards. He would only take cash, and I think he charged us more than. So he didn't seem to be a very honorable person himself, but he was raging against those awful immigrants. So it's a very, seemed to me, complicated kind of emotional issue.
And note that the mayor of New York City is encouraging a fair bit of the idea that it's immigration that is breaking New York City's budget. And to be as clear as possible, the amount that's being spent on the recent influx of immigrants is maybe 1% of the overall New York City budget. It's a budget that didn't have that 1% in it, and so it's creating problems. But it's not as if it is completely swamping and overwhelming the budget. But then also note that Mayor Adams is an African-American man, right? And so there is some very interesting cross-cutting currents happening in our politics right now. And I didn't have a chance to say all of this to you today, but we've talked about it in the past. One of the real important movements that explains the path to electoral viability of Donald Trump is the movement of everybody with racial, ethnic, gender, religious antagonism into the Republican Party, right? And that is a strain, for better or worse, of our politics, mainly for worse, that is there and can be tapped. And part of the reason the Republican Party is so deeply in the hold of Donald Trump, despite all of his legal troubles, is because he delivers those people to the party in the way that nobody else does. I'm tempted to say take Uber next time, Ruth. John's going to tell me why you didn't.
No, I was actually just going to observe that in passing, you mentioned the African-American mayor of New York complaining about immigration, but we really should remember that the opponents of immigration have historically been labor unions and workers on the left. The people that were in favor of immigration in the United States were always big business, both for exactly the same reason. Large-scale immigration holds wages down on everybody because people would work cheaper. Now, the whole politics of that has changed a lot since those days, but nonetheless, immigration, it seems to me, is one of the most, in both a theoretical and in a practical political sense, is one of the most fascinating and difficult issues we have in the United States, and I keep hoping you'll talk about it sometime.
Well, I spoke about it for 10 seconds today in a couple slides, but having said that, I mean, and I have done some of the research. It seems to me that sector by sector, you actually have to be careful in asserting that immigration drives wages for native workers down. That's true in some sectors. It's been true in construction and some of the service sectors, but it tends to be less true in other sectors of the economy, for instance, agricultural labor. But having said all of that, not the day to probably have this conversation. I'm not really prepared to have it, but yes, it is complicated, and you are absolutely right that unions have often been anti-immigrant, and so I shouldn't be so surprised that Mayor Eric Adams is, and I don't want to say he's anti-immigrant, right, but I do want to say that he is pulling that issue perhaps into the discourse in a way that I find a little bit misleading, because of the claim that it's wrecking the budget when in fact it's such a small portion of the budget. But yes, it is something for us to discuss going forward, and it is a potent, potentially explosive issue. And then let's just note, you know, the genuine influx of refugees that are coming to our society, the large number of migrants trying to cross from the southern border, is going to be completely dwarfed in the second half of the 21st century, if we continue on the course we're on in terms of climate change. And I don't think there's any way we don't continue on that. So what is now a problem numbered in the hundreds of thousands or millions will be a problem numbered in the hundreds of millions or billions in the coming 50 years. All right, everyone. Good being with you as always. You guys be well, take care of yourselves. look forward to speaking with you next weekend. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.